All right, here we are. April classes. Only 2 more. So this is good. We're kind of winding down. Feeling good? No?
Feeling worse.
Feeling worse. Come. Why?
Exam tests.
Oh, tests, yeah, exams.
What's that mean? That's the judgment.
You don't have any exams in this class though, so
What?
you don't have any exams in this class. You can feel good about that. You do, however, this I believe was on the syllabus for due in April, but I'm going to push it to May. Is the essay about the prophetic callings. So, kind of explaining maybe the differences between the different callings between Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then how that kind of relates to us. So just as much as you want to write on that, doesn't have to be any specific amount. I don't think. Maybe it was 500 words. I can't remember. But so no, I don't think it was 1,000. Well, let's go with 500. So 500 words on the prophetic calls, and then how we can apply those to our lives, or what it kind of means to us, what it says to us, what we get out of it. Just take a look at that, and then that'll be due by May when we have classes on the 20th. So just be mindful of that. So today, though, we've come through Isaiah, Jeremiah. We looked at Lamentations as well in this class, and we did Ezekiel, and now we're moving on to Daniel, who happens to be one of my favorite characters in the Bible, and this book is actually one of my favorite books in the Bible as well. There's no handout. No, there is no handout for this today. Do what? Daniel? Yeah. So we'll take a look at just kind of Daniel himself and kind of the context of the book this morning, and so looking at Daniel himself, the person, and then him as the author of this book, as well as kind of what's going on in Israel at this time when he's writing, and what's going on. He actually wasn't in Israel. He was like Ezekiel. He was in Babylon with the captives. He was among those that had been deported in the second deportation. Ezekiel was in the first deportation, and here Daniel is in the second deportation in 605 BC. Actually, I have that wrong. Daniel was in the first deportation in 605. Ezekiel came later in 597. So
was the first?
Yeah, Daniel was in the first deportation of Israelites. So he and Ezekiel share kind of a different perspective than each of the others, because the others were still in Israel. They were in Jerusalem, where the majority of the Israelites were, where the temple was, and all of that. And so their prophecies were to the Israelites who were still in their home country. But Ezekiel and Daniel had the unique opportunity, I guess if you want to phrase it that way, to be with the captives in exile when they were taken captive. So they are there in Babylon. Now, Ezekiel was just just among the people, but Daniel and his 3 friends were in the king's court. They had taken some of the royalty of that day, their children, and they had brought them to Babylon and put them in the king's palace in order to serve in the royal palace in kind of a political role, and kind of a strategic move on Nebuchadnezzar's part, or at least on the part of Babylon. I don't know that he was the first one that did this, but basically if you take the royal children, you can pretty much guarantee that the people back home are going to do what you say because you got their kids. So it was this political strategy that Nebuchadnezzar was using, and I don't know that it originated with him, but we see him employ this strategy that he takes the royal children and brings them to his court in order to serve him and to do what he needed them to do, but then also as a way to pressure and keep the parents kind of under tabs. So back in Israel, their parents were there and kind of, in positions of authority, and Daniel is one of those Hebrew children, if you will, that was deported. Wow, I'm making up words today. This is going to be good. He was deported, and he was there in Babylon. So he's known to us for several different things. We know what's some things we know about Daniel that kind of stick out to you. What do we know about Daniel? Famous stories.
The most famous one is the one where he's put in the lion's den.
Right, Daniel in the lion's den, yeah. And that story's told here in his book. Others? Anything?
The prophecies.
The prophecies, yeah, that's a big portion of his book, chapters 7 through 12, and known because of the prophetic, and then sometimes known because it's just like, what? Like you read it and it's just like, what? What's going on? Very good. Yeah, so other things that we know about Daniel. What's something else we know?
He was favoured by Nebuchadnezzar. So
Yeah.
he was, because Nebuchadnezzar had a lot of respect for him.
Yeah.
Yeah. He
Absolutely.
was a very prayerful. He was very prayerful man.
Yeah, very prayerful. Excellent, yeah.
His faith and work hard.
Yeah.
Unshakable.
Yeah, an unshakable faith. Because imagine yourself taken out of your context, out of your familiarity. And he was a young man. We don't know exactly how young. Some have said as young as 12, although there's some speculation. I tend to go with probably 20, around between 18 and 20 when he was taken away. And so that's still quite young in formative
Right,
years.
to us it's young, but
Do what?
to us that would be young, but was it young to them?
No, probably not super young to them because, again, the age of maturity I think was around 12 for them, but quite young when you think about the formation of religious practice and religious ideals. It was different than it is today, but we see him display this rock-solid faith in God and an unshakable relationship with God and an adherence to His laws. So much so that in the first chapter, when they are given the king's meat and all of the food that the king was providing for them, Daniel and his 3 friends said, "We can't eat this because according to the Mosaic law, we can't eat this, we can't partake of this." And asked for a special diet. They gave it to them, and then God blessed, and they appeared healthier than the other people who were with them that were eating the king's meat. And so their faith, their attention to their morals, even in a strange land. These are my convictions. This is what I believe, and I'm not going to waver in that. And there's something very, very valuable in that, because I feel like if Daniel had not done that from the very, 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 very beginning, that we wouldn't read all of the other cool things that happened, where he interpreted the king's dream. The fiery furnace didn't necessarily happen to Daniel himself, but to his 3 friends. We wouldn't read about that. We wouldn't read it in chapter 4, where God used him to pronounce judgment towards Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar became a beast, as a 4-footed beast, the Bible says. In chapter 4, he interprets the writing on the wall, and then in chapter 6, he's in the lion's den. I don't think we would read any of those subsequent things if first, in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, is the theme of this book, and it's for Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Every single test that came against Daniel and his friends was an effort to defile them, either religiously or morally, and they were not willing to defile themselves. And let's drag this into our day. There is a very real need for us to have that same kind of tenacity to say, you know what, these are my morals, these are my convictions, and I'm not going to cross them. And there's a need to essentially pre-think some situations that we may be faced with. We're faced with things today that are just, there's really no preparing ourselves for them. I mean, we have Scripture and we have the Bible, but some of the things that are happening today are not just specifically mentioned in the Bible that we should do this or we shouldn't do this. We have to go back to the principles of God's Word. And that's essentially what Daniel and his friends were doing as well. Now, they did have the Mosaic Law, but there were some principles that they were living by that would not allow them to bow down to a golden image. It would not allow them to pray to any other being than God. That would not allow them to eat certain things. And so we see their decision to stay true and stay faithful to God and His Word and what they knew, the relationship to God. It actually elevated them. Now, you know, the whole fiery furnace thing happened because they chose to be true to their morals, to be true to their convictions. But as a result of that, God stepped in. He said, you know, I'm going to save you from that. I'm going to preserve you from that. And then we see God elevate them to higher positions in the kingdom. And every single time, it wasn't just a matter of God saw that they did good and then He elevated them. No, there was that period where they kind of suffered for what they believed. And there was that, there was that struggle, there was that opposition. And the same is going to be true for us. We're going to stand for our morals and stand for our beliefs, but that doesn't mean that God's going to just automatically give us what we want because we're standing for Him. No, there's going to be some opposition, there's going to be some struggle. But do we have the tenacity to hold on to those things through that struggle to get to the other side? And so we see in the book of Daniel, it's a beautiful picture of the before, the during, and the after of all of that. Because we see if we will hold on to our convictions, if we'll hold on to the promises of God's Word, even through the difficulty, the struggle, and the trial, when we come out on the other side, there's blessing and there's help waiting for us. And that's really the whole entire point of all of the prophets. There's going to be judgment that comes, but there is future restoration as well. Because God never leaves us empty-handed. He never leaves us just out there all on our own. And so, I probably skipped into a little bit of next month's lesson with that. But that's the crux. That's the heart of the book of Daniel for me, is the fact that they held to their convictions. And had they not, we wouldn't read about them. We wouldn't read about these cool stories, these neat stories of the lion's den, the fiery furnace, the handwriting on the wall. We wouldn't hear about that if these men had not held so strong to their convictions. We get the cool stories because they had some very, very real problems because they held so tightly to their convictions and their beliefs. And so, we can't just expect the blessings and expect the cool stories without knowing, hey, I'm going to have to hold on to this. And there's going to be some struggle that comes along with this. But just mentally preparing for that, pre-thinking and saying, you know what, in this situation, no matter what happens, I'm going to hold true to God's Word. I'm going to do what I know to do and stay true to Him, faithful to His commandments, and the blessing results out of that. So he was one of the Hebrew children that we've learned about. He is a survivor of the lion's den. He was an interpreter of dreams. He's the author of this book that is 12 chapters here in the Old Testament. He was, as I said, a Jewish captive that was carried off in the first conquest of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. And again, that was 605 BC. And so several years before the fall of Jerusalem, which happened in 586. And so this book of Daniel covers about 70 years worth of history. Now, it is the 70 years that the Israelites were in exile. So they were in exile for 70 years, and Daniel's book covers that period of time. We see it picks up right at the very beginning, because again, he was among the first that was deported. He was among the first that went into exile, and that was in 605. And then all the way through, the latest known incident of his life in this book is recorded at 536 BC. So it spans about 70 years. Exactly. And so, so in that time, that's the time frame we're reading in. So in that time is 586, which is the fall of Jerusalem, which is one of the famous dates, and especially significant for the major prophets that we're studying. His book doesn't record his death, but many scholars have placed the writing of his book being completed in the last decade of his life. So he kind of, he lived through all this, and then he compiled this writing. Daniel's name means God is my judge. Exactly. God is my judge. And, I think we kind of see Daniel living by that name. He didn't live his life as if the Babylonians were going to judge him, or his friends were going to judge him, or any other authority was going to judge him. He lived as if, God is my judge, and I've got to stay true to what he has said. And so we kind of see him living up to his name, and significant, and we'll get into this a little bit more next month, but it's significant that in the book of Daniel, we see that Nebuchadnezzar changed their names. So Daniel became Belteshazzar, Hananiah became Shadrach, Hananiah, Azariah became Abednego, and Mishael became Meshach. And so they had Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, in Israel. That's what they were known by, Daniel. And then when they were taken captive, Nebuchadnezzar changed their names and gave them different names. Now, we most commonly refer to the three Hebrew boys as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but that's actually their Babylonian names. And it's interesting that Daniel, whenever he references them, he never references them by their Babylonian name unless it's in relation to Nebuchadnezzar.
What was Daniel's name changed to? Sorry?
Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar. I believe. Yeah. And, so he kind of lived his life by his name, and their names, I've mentioned this before, but their names had glimpses of God in them. So El, Daniel, in his name, the El there is referring to God, is the Hebrew term for God. And, Ezekiel, that's a reference to God. And so you would see that in Hebrew names. And so their names had significance religiously for them. And so when they were taken into Babylon, when those names were trying to be changed, it was essentially taking God out of their name and putting in the gods of the Babylonians. And so we'll get into that a little bit more next time, and I'll kind of go through all the meanings of their names. It's really interesting. But the important part of that is just to remember that Daniel, again, didn't live his life as if anybody else was his judge, or that he was on display for anybody else. It was he and God. His focus was God. If he pleased God, that was good enough for him. It didn't matter to him if everybody else was pleased. If he could please others, that was great. But if he had to cross others in order to please God, he was going to please God. That was going to be his focus and his direction. And I love that. I love that about Daniel, and I love that we have that in the Word of God. So again, he was of royal blood. We see that in chapter 1, verse 3. And he was from the kingdom of Judah, which is mentioned in chapter 1, verse 6. He was taken with other young men, other young nobles, and they were selected for an education in the king's court. So they were going to be learning, it says, in learning in the tongue of the Chaldeans in chapter 1, verse 4, for service at the Babylonian court. And so they were going to go through a schooling program, essentially, learning various things, and that was all so they could be, so the Babylonian Empire could grow and expand, and they would use these conquered peoples to do that. But Daniel was also given understanding in all visions and dreams, and his reputation extended pretty far. So it wasn't just a matter of what the king was wanting him to do, but here we see him kind of commissioned by God, even in this strange land, to do certain things. And Ezekiel mentions Daniel a couple of different times. It makes several references to him. His righteousness, he twice compares him with Noah and Job, who were prominent figures, of course, in Israelite history. Daniel was able to exercise his gifts in the court until the first year of Cyrus, it says in chapter 1, verse 21. He interpreted the writing on the wall that was predicting Babylon's overthrow at the hand of the Medes and Persians. So the Medes and the Persians were going to come in and take over. It was prophesied. We'll talk about it in chapter 2. And then we see it happen in the book of Daniel. And so he's kind of in this transitional time where Babylon is trying to assert its influence in the world, and they end up getting asserted over by the Medes and the Persians. And through all of that, Daniel was then elevated to the rank of, he was the third ruler in the kingdom. He was pretty high up there. When he was thrown into the lion's den, he was a very prominent figure in the political realm of that day. His enemies, under King Darius, his enemies took advantage of his faithfulness to God, and they successfully conspired against him. They devised this plan, the whole lion's den story. They devised this plan that said nobody could pray except anyone to Darius, and they knew that Daniel was faithful in his prayers to God. And so they said, well, let's make a law where they can only pray to Darius. And he, of course, transgressed that law. They threw him in the lion's den. But the miraculous delivery, again, elevated him in the king's eyes and gave him a position of prominence. He survived this 70-year exile, and he remained in Babylon until his death. We don't read that he went back to Jerusalem. Now, Cyrus, who was the king that ended up letting the Israelites go back after 70 years, Daniel served under him, and for whatever reason, decided, I'm not going to go back. God has a plan for me here, and I'm going to stay here and continue to fulfill it. And so he didn't go back to Israel with the captives that were able to return. He stayed there in the land of Babylon, and he was very successful there, even in that time of harsh treatment, perhaps. Probably not so much for him, as they were in the palace, treated fairly well, but still in a place that you're unfamiliar with, separated from home and family and various things. And still he prospered and he thrived, and he allowed God to use him. And I just love the story of Daniel. He's such a picture of what I want to be in my life. Some people have said Daniel didn't write the book of Daniel, but it's kind of much the same as those that said Isaiah didn't write all of Isaiah, because they feel like it's impossible that he could have predicted events that would happen 450 years in the future. Well, if God is in the midst of that, then there is that possibility. So scholars look at this and they're like, Daniel is making predictions about things that happened 450 years in the future, and they happened exactly as he stated them. There's no way that Daniel could have written it. It had to have been written by somebody who was looking back on that history as it happened. But that's discounting the power and the sovereignty of God. And so we do believe that Daniel wrote this book. He uses first person several different times in the book, where he says I, Daniel, or myself, or however he does it. But he phrases it in such a way that he talking about himself as the author of the book. These people that would kind of disregard Daniel as the author, basically disregarding, as we've said, the omniscience of God, that God knows all things, and that God is all powerful and can just download that information into Daniel for him to be able to, that would be like you or myself talking about something that's going to happen in 2050, or 2450, way off into the future. God can do that. God can give that understanding. He can give that wisdom, that revelation for us, for us to be able to write that down, document that. God can do that. And so those that don't believe that just disregard that God is omniscient. He knows all things. He knows the end from the beginning. There's nothing going to happen that takes God by surprise. But we see this a lot in our day, don't we? We see that people, they'll just discount events that can't be explained. They can't put their finger on what happened. They can't, understand fully how there's a miracle of healing or there's a miracle of provision, and so they'll kind of discount it. They'll kind of try to explain it in other ways. Well, that wasn't necessarily God. It was just, confluence of, circumstances all coming together at the right time, right place, and they'll just kind of try to explain it away like that. I'll be honest, there's been times that I've been guilty of maybe doing that to an extent, in a certain way. But just, I have to bring myself back to the realization that, you know what? God is able. He's omniscient, and He's able to do these things. A diagnosis can change because a miracle-working God steps in and removes a tumor or causes a bone to grow where there wasn't one before. Critics may look at modern miracles and explain them away in any way they can by saying, well, surely God didn't give you a word of prophecy or a word of knowledge because that can't be explained. But God did, and He still does give words of prophecy. He did and still does miraculous works of healing. And so don't let the naysayers rob you of your faith in an almighty God. God is able to heal no matter what the diagnosis is. And where the doctors say there's no hope, God can step in and bring healing. He can. He's omniscient, He's omnipotent, and He can and He will do those things. He does those things. He did them, and He still does those things. And so if we're going to believe God about those things, it should carry over, and we can say, you know what, I believe that God is preserving His word, and that He gave Daniel, He gave those foresights, if you will, into the prophets. Not just Daniel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, they all prophesied about the future, and those things happened. And so it wasn't a matter of somebody coming in and writing history after the fact. No, they were proclaiming it before it ever happened, because that's how powerful God is. And so just be reminded today and be filled with hope that God is powerful in your life and in your circumstances. God's sovereign. There's no name higher than His name. He is a sovereign God. His power and His influence is over all other power and influence. So let's mention, just as we move forward and think about, about 10 more minutes, about 20 more minutes. Look at the book itself. We'll look at the book itself. This book was written about 573 BC, so in the last decade of Daniel's life. He is, winding down, I guess you would say. About 573 BC. Fall of Jerusalem happened in 586, and then we have, some say it was written here in 573. Of course, there's always differing opinions. So if you go and read a book and it says a different date, that's just fairly common. This is one that was pretty well agreed upon between several, and so. But the book of Daniel is found, obviously, in the major prophets. That's why we're studying it in major prophets. But in the Hebrew Bible, so in the English Bible, it's in the major prophets. But in the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is actually found within what's called the writings. Now, what you would find in the writings is also Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Those books are called the writings. They're more, I guess, poetic in nature. So you would have the law, the prophets, and the writings were the three sections of the Hebrew Bible. Now the English Bible, we have the law and we have major and minor prophets, and we have the poetry books, and we have history books. So we have various and sundry things. All of those fit under 3 categories in the Hebrew Bible: the law, the prophets, and the writings. Daniel falls in the writings of the Hebrew Bible sections, but and that's due to the fact that it's different in character than the other major prophets. We don't see a whole lot in Daniel about him doing what Ezekiel did or Isaiah did and Jeremiah did and saying, look out, this destruction is coming upon Jerusalem, this is going to happen. We don't see a whole lot of that in the book of Daniel. In fact, we see hardly any of it now in chapters 7 through 12, those prophetic portions. That's really, they are prophetic portions about what's going to happen in kind of the near future, but really most of them have to do with the very far distant future, which we still have yet to experience in our lives. And so, because he's not like the rest of the prophets, that's why he's kind of put in the writings. It's just a different characterization of his book. He was never really referred to as a prophet. He was referred to as a seer or a wise man, but never really a prophet. And so that's another reason that his books were placed in the, or his book rather, was placed in the writings alongside the Proverbs of Solomon and the Psalms of David. We have the writings of Daniel. It is right and correct to classify Daniel as apocalyptic writing because of its series of supernatural visions that happen in chapters 7 through 12. Now, apocalyptic simply means an unveiling of truth which would otherwise be concealed. So that's what the word apocalyptic means. An unveiling of truth which would otherwise be concealed. And so we see Daniel in chapters 7 through 12 unveiling a truth about the future that would otherwise have been concealed in the secrets and the mysteries of God, if you will. But we see God kind of pull back the curtain, allow Daniel to see some things and allow him to write about those things. And so, you know, people have taken the word apocalyptic and they've made it, you know, mean something, you know, great and grandiose and something like scary, you know.
And stuff and
Yeah.
crazy.
The apocalypse, you know, and it's like just this scary, and surely, you know, certainly it does have that connotation, I suppose, but really the word apocalyptic just simply means an unveiling of truth which would otherwise be concealed. And so, you know, we think of the future as mysterious because we don't know what's coming. And so there's this truth that has been concealed, or, you know, the facts that have been concealed from us in the future because we haven't lived there yet. And so there's this era of mystery which I think lends itself towards
It
this.
was actually told Daniel beforehand so that we could learn.
Yeah, yeah.
That's accurate, that we can learn what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So draw back and do what's right.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is coming, so straighten up and fly right, as they say. There is other apocalyptic literature in the Bible. Anybody want to venture a guess as to what that book would be? Revelation. Revelation is the other apocalyptic book of the Bible. And so it follows very closely with Revelation. In fact, you can line up certain prophecies in the book of Daniel from chapters 7 through 12. You can line them up literally with Revelation. And perhaps next month I'll be able to show you some of how those kind of zipper together there and where you can kind of find the equivalent story. Of course, now that's from John's perspective. So there, you know, if you look at Daniel and if you look at John's Revelation, you might not readily see the similarities because John saw it one way and Daniel saw it another. They're two different persons. They're two different personalities. They're going to notice two different things. If God even showed them the exact same picture, they would notice two different things. You know, so it's like that age-old story.